sort of a grab bag of items from the World War II experience. Much of this may be some review that you may have experienced in US too, but we wanted to make sure we touched on a number of elements. So I'm going to provide you kind of three areas of the Second World War that I want to delve into here that hopefully will give you a little bit more of a global perspective on the conflict and be able to evaluate it in perhaps some new ways. The first of which is I want to provide you a strategic overview, sort of if you're looking for how all the different elements kind of come together, the various sides, Axis allies, who's with who. Hopefully we'll bring that out. Also, I want to talk briefly about occupied resistance, meaning if you're a person living in an occupied country, what does that mean for you? What are some examples where we can see that being carried out? And finally, contributions beyond the battlefield, where non-traditional elements, non-military elements of society played critical roles. So, opposing sides. What are the opposing sides in the Second World War? Much of this may be familiar to you from US 2, but if not, there's basically what are called the Axis powers and the Allied powers. The Axis powers are going to be Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan. The Allied powers are going to be Great Britain, the remnants of the British Empire, which at this point was still very much in place at the time. The Soviet Union, remember, Russia was taken over during 1917 to the early 1920s by the Bolsheviks, the communists, and they established the Soviet Union. And interestingly, in the Second World War, the world's largest communist power decides to ally itself with the world's largest capitalist powers, the United States and Great Britain, to defeat Nazi Germany. And that's a very key alliance that really ultimately prevails in World War II. The United States, of course, which you investigated quite a bit last year, and China, at least the portion of China that's not occupied by the Japanese, is going to play a critical role in the Allied powers. And these nations are going to play the determining role of making up the international order after the Second World War ends. If you look at the UN Security Council today, you're going to see Britain, Russia, the United States, China. These are all players, and their victory, the fact that they prevailed in the Second World War is a big part of that. So where is the fighting happening? Broadly speaking, Europe and Asia / the Pacific. I wanted to give you just some overview concepts that govern these theaters of conflict. There are initial German successes in the Second World War. In fact, if you were a betting person, you were going back to 1940, early 1941, the odds of German ultimate success, Axis success, seemed kind of high. They had been victorious in defeating France, the major Western European power that they had historically been opposed to. They were running roughshod over most of Eastern Europe by mid-1941. The odds of a German victory in Europe seemed very realistic. And the concept that the Germans were aiming to kind of impose through their victory, Mrs. Clark mentioned this on Tuesday, I wanted to reinforce it here, is this concept of Lebensraum. Nazi ideology was very much rooted in this idea that ethnically pure, superior Germans should not just be confined to political Germany. That there were German populations scattered throughout Eastern Europe, and there were many impure, inferior populations that needed to be, if not exterminated, directed into hard labor, into some sort of subservient, inferior position. And the German occupation of Eastern Europe was very much rooted in this idea that the Slavic populations, the Jewish populations, other elements needed to be brought under control, and that living space was needed for the German people. In the Pacific, similarly, the Japanese had a somewhat similar vision. They wanted to create what's called the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. This was an idea that the Japanese felt would unify a lot of the people of Asia. They felt that Western white European powers had colonized much of Asia, which is totally true, but they saw themselves as sort of leading the charge against that, and they could sort of replace the European powers in terms of their occupation, that they themselves would be leading this new order in Asia. What it equated to was Japanese occupation of a lot of areas. If you look right here, this is Japan at its maximum point of conquest. At its peak, if you were to go back to early 1942, Japan was in control of what we call French Indochina, what used to be called that. Today it'd be Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, which was part of the old American colonial system, as well as a huge chunk of mainland China and Korea, which wasn't divided at this point. Japan's goal was to unify all of that into one political economic entity. That was their vision. Similarly, in Nazi Germany, at their peak in late 1941, thereabouts, they were not only in control of Germany, but pretty much all of France, at least politically speaking, and the vast network of resources that is Eastern Europe. Lots of farmland. They hoped to resettle with ethnically pure Germans, like I mentioned, but also deep into Russia. And speaking of Russia, I wanted to jump forward to this quote. This is from Mein Kampf. Hitler wrote this. Remember, Mrs. Clark talked about this in prison in the 1920s. He talks about his grand vision very early on. But when we speak of new territories in Europe today, we must principally think of Russia and the border states subject to her. Destiny itself wish to point out the way for us here. In delivering Russia over to Bolshevism, meaning communism, fate robbed Russian people of that intellectual class that had once created the Russian state and were the guarantee of its existence. For the Russian state was not organized by the constructive political talent of the Slav element. Again, Hitler very quick to point out that the racial element of the Slavs was the inferior one, that in fact all of previous modern Russia was constructed by German elements. Again, he saw everything through this racial lens. But was much more marvelous exemplification of the capacity for state building possessed by the German element in a race of inferior worth. Essentially, Hitler believed that Russia was made up of German elements that controlled the political situation, but had to coexist with inferior Slavic people. And that he would remedy this, and the German state would remedy this, by attacking and occupying and repopulating Eastern Europe. So I want to also continue with this question that kind of pulls everything together, hopefully. Why did the Axis collapse? Why did the Axis powers collapse and the Allies prevail? What are some reasons that historians have pointed to? Number one, Japan, in terms of its occupation, as long as it maintained those areas of conquest, it would be able to marshal all sorts of resources from mainland China to Southeast Asia. But after it was locked in a military struggle with the United States, where access to those resources was disrupted, Japan faced some real difficulties, some real strains to maintaining a long-term war effort. So Japan's not going to be able to do that, historians will point out. Great Britain's going to play a pivotal role here. Britain refuses to, when it could have, to make peace with Nazi Germany. This is astoundingly surprising to a lot of the Nazi war planners, Hitler included. From his point of view, Britain had everything to gain by cooperating with the Nazis. Yes, the Nazis would become a new state that would control Europe, but at the time, they kind of felt Britain would be allowed to keep its empire, to keep its identity. And if you look back to it at the time, that seemed plausible. This is from historian Stanley Payne, who's an expert on fascism and Nazi Germany in the Second World War. He puts this out there, and I think this is an intriguing concept. Despite the brutality of his designs, Hitler expected to find indispensable allies or complicity abroad. The most important would be the British Empire. He proposed to support, in exchange for return of old German colonies, which he felt was wrongly taken away from World War I, and a free hand on the continent. Anglo-Saxon racial cousins were not targets of Nazi expansionism and the racial revolution. And its undetermined fashion, they might be helpful allies in the eventual and ultimate struggle for world power, probably directed at the United States. What that kind of translates to is that Nazi Germany really felt it could cooperate and it could find cooperation elsewhere around the world for its grand objectives. When Britain refuses to, when it could have kind of maintained its empire, that is a real kind of wrench in their plans. Germany opts for, at the time, also a two-front war. They choose to not only engage with a fight with Great Britain and the French Empire, which they succeed in defeating, but also with the Soviet Union, a much more populated people. I want to stop there, and I want to bring your attention. Ultimately, Britain makes that decision not to cooperate with Nazi Germany. And at the same time, the Soviet Union, who Germany does choose to pick a fight with, and chooses to invade and carry out their plan of Lebensraum, they're willing to make extreme, and I use that in every full sense of the word, extreme sacrifices to win the war and prevail and to marshal all possible human and material resources. And to put that into some perspective, I want to show you this chart. World War II deaths. The x-axis is in millions. So if you look at the number of people killed in the Second World War, it also differentiates between military death and civilian death. The Soviet Union loses somewhere around 24 million people, half of which are military, half of which are civilians. China, during the Japanese occupation, very similar losses, but at the same time, most of theirs are concentrated in civilian loss of life, largely through starvation, through the appropriation of food by the Japanese army, and all sorts of brutality exacted in the urban and rural regions. Poland also suffers greatly, but interestingly, you have to go down this list a fair ways before you get to the United States, Great Britain, Germany, or Japan itself. And the reason I mention this is because a lot of the costs, the human costs of the Second World War, are borne by societies and people who are not even directly engaged in the military fighting, but they just happen to find themselves with an opposing army sweeping through, and that's what makes World War II so horrific on civilian populations. This puts it into even greater perspective. This is loss of life as percentage of the pre-war population, 1939 that is. So, Poland, this statistic astounds me. If you go by its 1939 population, Poland lost 17%, nearly 1 in 5 of its population, just from the war. And that's just death. If you factor in refugees, people who were dislocated through various threatening armies and disruptions to life, it's going to be even greater. Poland is a completely different country, region of Europe, as a result of this. We know it's going to be a focal point for the Holocaust of the European Jewish population, and so on. Soviet Union, of course, is going to be high, but it started out with a bigger number. The Soviet Union makes those extreme sacrifices. Additionally, the U.S., who kind of comes in halfway through the war, much longer, especially if you're taking into account what Japan was doing in Asia, the U.S. mobilizes its resources, overwhelming resources, at critical times, when it needed to ultimately prevail. And these are some reasons that together offer an explanation to that. These are images of women in the Soviet military during the war. The Soviet Union is going to call on women to serve in all sorts of capacities in fighting. You're going to see that within the Red Army. Oftentimes they're going to take roles as snipers, but they're going to be in combat positions. This is a U.S. propaganda poster from the time. And speaking of propaganda, I wanted to make mention of this. It's a U.S. propaganda poster. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Join a car-sharing club today. This might be familiar to you from US 2. The U.S. was very much engaged in the rationing of resources, but comparatively, in terms of the strains on its day-to-day existence, the U.S. doesn't suffer nearly as much as you're going to see in many parts of Europe or especially Asia. So, secondly, what's it like to be within an area of the globe that's under occupation? One area is going to be Vichy France, France that's controlled by the Germans after 1940. Another, of course, is going to be Poland, which was taken over very early on in the war in 1939. And finally, Yugoslavia. There are many other areas we could talk about. These are 3 areas where resistance proved pretty decisive and brings out some other elements to the war that we can talk about. France. The French faced a very difficult, I guess, kind of dilemma, and we talked about this with the Hitler Youth yesterday a bit as well. They were a major Western European industrialized power. They're defeated. They have, major urban industrialized advanced centers, center for arts, culture, and their leadership had to grapple with the possibility of, we know what Nazi Germany is, we know it's doing terrible things, do we resist it at risk to our own lives? After all, we lost the war, we lost the fighting part of the war. Or do we collaborate with it to some varying degree, whether it's passive collaboration or active collaboration? And this is a big part of French history, is how did the French react to that 4 years of occupation, really 4 or 5 years of occupation, where the political regime, if you wanted to retain power in France, if you wanted to still have basic freedoms, you had to kind of go along with what the Germans wanted. Some of the French are going to leave France. They're going to become part of what are called the Free French Forces. They're going to escape to England and avoid the occupation and then come back after the Normandy landings. But some are going to continue to fight even up until the end, be resistance, saboteur forces trying to make life difficult for the German occupying forces. Many of them are going to be killed, but also do some pretty heroic acts. Occupied Poland. Poland is probably one of the worst places you could be, territorially speaking, during the war. The Germans carry out what is called a Germanization plan, which, broadly speaking, is ethnic cleansing. This is a term modern demographers and people who analyze international politics still see throughout the world happening. It's basically the purposeful relocation or killing of people of a certain ethnic group, and oftentimes repopulating it with a new ethnic group. We see this still today. It can be observed in many parts of the world. In World War II, this happens in Poland. The Germans, Nazi Germany in particular, has this deep ideology of Lebensraum, the idea that Eastern Europe should be repopulated with ethnically pure Germans. But to do that, you have to get rid of the people who are there. They're going to, of course, start and focus on the Jewish populations, often very concentrated in Poland, but they're also going to spread that amongst the Slavic people. Much of the Germanization plan is built around this idea that there are elements of redeemable German communities throughout Eastern Europe that could maybe be brought in to the new German state that would be created, but all of the others can be forced into some combination of forced labor, resettlement, or extermination. And that's what's going to make this portion of the war so brutal and so horrific in terms of loss of human life. Yugoslav partisans, Yugoslavia also falls under German domination, but interestingly, they managed to create a resistance force of tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands of people within occupied German lines. This is going to be led by a guy named Josip Broz Tito, who will go on to be the dictator of Yugoslavia in the years after the war. But it's an example of people sort of rising up against the occupiers. This is a Yugoslav partisan off to the left here. This is him right before he's about to get executed. He gives this long live freedom sort of speech before he's killed. The guy right to his right here is going to be Charles de Gaulle. He's going to be president of France in the years after the war. He's going to be the leader of the Free French forces in exile in England during the war as a result. And he's going to give these radio broadcasts, essentially encouraging resistors to prevail. And ultimately, Paris is liberated and de Gaulle marches through kind of triumphantly. This is an image of kind of the German resettlement plan. Their thinking was, find the ethnically acceptable German populations, and they had researchers within the Third Reich who would try to figure out there were Germans who settled here in like the 1400s. We can bring them back, and they're redeemable, but these other people, they're not. So there was a quite an extensive effort to try to do this. Finally, non-traditional elements of the Second World War, beyond the battlefield, contributions from people that we often don't think of when we think of World War II. The first of these is going to be the female population in Great Britain, which in many ways contribute in a number of ways, but one way we're going to see here is through the women of Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park is a code-breaking sort of nerve center for counterintelligence within Britain during the war. One of their main objectives is to try to break the German and Japanese codes for communicating between ships and planes, and if they can do so, they can counteract those threats. And women are going to play a big role. Because manpower is so strained in Britain before or during the war, they have to turn to the civilian population and get their talents any which way they can. One of the ways they're going to do this, the British government that is they're going to send out sort of lateral thinking activities, puzzles, almost like Sudoku exercises, in the newspapers and get people to compete for completing these puzzles. And the people who score the highest, the women who score the highest, are going to be brought in for assessment to possibly work in these Bletchley Park cryptanalysis activities, where again they're trying to break German codes. I want to show you a short clip. I'm going to pause this here.